No one in that room realized a line had been crossed until it was already too late to step back. The lights were doing what lights always do in those rooms, flattening everything into something safe, controlled, predictable. The laughter arrived on cue, not because anything was especially funny, but because laughter is the currency of these events, a signal to the audience that nothing dangerous is happening here. Two actors sat side by side, bodies angled politely towards the host, close enough to suggest familiarity but not intimacy, close enough to sell a project but not a truth. This was supposed to be just another appearance, another piece of promotional machinery doing what it has done thousands of times before: extract charm, suppress honesty, package connection, and move on. But something went wrong. Or rather, something went right in a way the system is designed to prevent. Because the most dangerous thing you can do in a controlled public space isn't to say something controversial. It's to say something true without permission. When the question came light, teasing, engineered to provoke a joke, it wasn't meant to expose anything. "Who's your dream man?" is a question designed to go nowhere. It invites fantasy, deflection, humor. It's a cul-de-sac of sincerity. Celebrities are trained for this. They know how to answer without answering, how to say something flattering without meaning it, how to keep the audience entertained while revealing absolutely nothing of consequence. That's why what followed felt so unsettling before anyone could explain why. Dakota Johnson didn't rush to fill the silence. She didn't laugh it off. She didn't perform. She paused, and in that pause, the machinery stalled. Her expression changed in a way that wasn't rehearsed, wasn't protective, wasn't public. It was the look of someone briefly forgetting where they were, forgetting the rules, forgetting the invisible contracts that govern moments like this. The audience laughed nervously, not because they were amused, but because people laugh when they sense instability and don't know how else to respond. And then she said it. Not loudly, not dramatically, without flourish. The kind of statement that doesn't announce itself as important, which is precisely why it is. "My dream man is someone I already know." That line didn't land like a revelation. It landed like a fault line. Because what made it arresting wasn't romance or implication or scandal. It was the fact that she hadn't framed it as performance. There was no wink, no theatrical pause for applause. She didn't present it as a story for the audience to enjoy. She presented it as a fact she had just realized she could no longer avoid. And the room felt it instantly. You can see it in the way the energy shifted, the way the laughter thinned, the way the host scrambled to regain control with a follow-up that suddenly sounded too loud, too forced, too late. You can see it in the camera operators tightening their shots, instinctively hunting for reaction, because reaction is what turns moments into currency. And most of all, you can see it in Jamie Dornan's body, because he didn't perform either. He didn't smile. He didn't lean into the moment. He didn't rescue it with humor or deflection. His body went still in the way people go still when they've been confronted with something they weren't prepared to carry in public. The kind of stillness that isn't strategy, but shock. His eyes dropped, his hands tightened, and in that silence was something far more revealing than any verbal response could have been. Silence, in these environments, is not neutral. It's a breach. What people responded to online wasn't the words. It was that breach. The collective recognition that something unscripted had happened in a space where unscripted things are quietly punished. Viewers didn't need to believe in romance to feel the tension. They needed only to recognize the sound of a system hiccuping, of a truth emerging where none was supposed to exist. That's why the clip didn't spread like gossip. It spread like evidence. Within minutes, it was being replayed, slowed down, dissected frame by frame, not because people were hunting for proof of an affair, but because they were trying to understand why it made them feel the way it did. Why a single sentence, delivered softly, could freeze a room full of professionals trained to keep things moving. Why one person's honesty could render another person wordless. And here's the uncomfortable part that most coverage missed entirely. The danger in that moment wasn't emotional. It was structural. Because Hollywood doesn't fear romance scandals. It thrives on them. What it fears is uncontrolled narrative. It fears moments that don't slot neatly into press releases, PR strategies, or reputational containment. And what Dakota Johnson did, intentionally or not, was introduce a narrative that could not be easily managed without someone paying a price. By the time the interview ended, the system had already begun doing what it always does in response to disruption. Silence from Jamie's team. No clarifications. No denials. No confirmations. Just absence. Because absence buys time, and time allows narratives to be reshaped, softened, redirected. But silence also invites projection. Fans filled the gap instantly because humans cannot tolerate unresolved emotional data. Hashtags framed the moment as confession, betrayal, romance, recklessness, anything that turned complexity into something consumable. And yet, beneath all of it, there was a quieter recognition that refused to go away. This didn't feel like acting. It didn't feel like a stunt. It felt like something that had slipped past the gatekeepers before anyone could stop it. Behind the scenes, the contrast was stark. Dakota alone with the consequences of speaking without armor. Jamie retreating into motion, into cars and distance and managerial voices talking about optics while he replayed the sentence that had detonated the day. Two people dealing with the same moment in opposite ways, neither of them able to undo it. The most revealing thing Jamie Dornan did after that interview wasn't what he said. It was that he said nothing at all. By the next morning, the story had already outgrown the moment that created it. Headlines were louder than the clip itself, more confident, more decisive. Language hardened. What had been ambiguity became accusation. What had been silence became implication. Dakota Johnson's words were no longer presented as something that happened. They were framed as something that had been done. To Jamie, to his marriage, to the audience. To the myth of professional distance everyone pretends still exists in Hollywood. And in the middle of that acceleration, Jamie vanished. In a media ecosystem that feeds on reaction, non-reaction is not passive. It's a political act. It shifts the burden of interpretation onto everyone else. Silence forces others to speak for you, fans, commentators, strangers with edit software and too much confidence. And the longer the silence lasts, the more it becomes the story itself. Why isn't he responding? That question spread faster than any rumor because it carried moral weight. Silence, to an audience conditioned by public confession culture, looks like evasion. It looks like guilt. It looks like cowardice. And yet, for people who live inside tightly managed reputational systems, silence is often the only remaining form of agency. Jamie Dornan understood something most observers didn't. The moment he spoke, the narrative would no longer belong to either of them. It would belong to the system waiting to consume it. Because any response, even a denial, would have collapsed the complexity of what happened into something digestible. A statement would have forced the story into clean lines, truth or lie, romance or fiction, loyalty or betrayal. And what made that moment so volatile was that it refused to sit cleanly in any of those categories. So he did the only thing available to him. He withdrew. Phones buzzed around him with escalating urgency. Managers, publicists, strategists all offering versions of the same advice dressed up as concern. Say something. Anything. Control the narrative before it controls you. But Jamie wasn't listening, not because he didn't understand the stakes, but because he understood them too well. He had spent years learning how quickly words become weapons once they leave your mouth. And he also knew something else, something harder to articulate, but impossible to ignore. If he spoke now, he wouldn't be speaking honestly. He would be speaking correctly. Across the city, Dakota Johnson was learning the inverse lesson. Where Jamie's silence was being framed as avoidance, Dakota's honesty was being reframed as provocation. Every headline sharpened her words into something more deliberate than they had been. Confession, admission, revelation, language that implied intent, strategy, desire for impact. The internet rarely believes in accidents, especially emotional ones. Vulnerability is tolerated only when it's tidy, pre-approved, and easily redeemed. But this wasn't tidy. Dakota hadn't planned a narrative. She had answered a question she was supposed to deflect, and the consequence of that refusal to perform was now unfolding in real time. Her manager's calls went unanswered not out of defiance, but paralysis. Because how do you clarify something that was never designed to be explained? To explain it would be to reduce it. To deny it would be to lie. To defend it would be to admit wrongdoing. There was no option that didn't flatten the truth into something smaller than what it had been. And while the public debated her intentions, something quieter and far more destructive was happening on the periphery. The story began to move towards Amelia Warner. It always does. In narratives like this, there is an unspoken demand that someone absorb the emotional fallout so the main tension can continue uninterrupted. And more often than not, that person is the woman who didn't ask to be part of the story at all. Amelia didn't speak. She didn't post. She didn't counter the speculation with public dignity performances or symbolic silence. She simply existed, and that existence became enough for strangers to project onto. Cruel messages flooded her social media, not because people knew anything, but because people needed resolution. They needed a villain or a victim, and when a story refuses to provide one, the audience will invent both. The irony, of course, is that Amelia was the one person whose position required no performance. She wasn't navigating optics. She wasn't protecting a brand. She was living inside a private reality being forcibly dragged into public interpretation. Those close to her would later say she wasn't angry. Anger would have been easier. Anger would have allowed for moral clarity. What she felt instead was something far more destabilizing: recognition. Recognition that what people had seen on that stage wasn't fabricated, that it came from a place of real connection. And that connection, even if it had never crossed a line, still had weight. Hollywood rarely prepares people for that kind of truth. We're taught to think betrayal requires action, that boundaries are only violated when behavior becomes explicit. But emotional gravity doesn't need physical movement to exist. It forms quietly over years of shared vulnerability, shared intensity, shared isolation from the outside world. Film sets are pressure cookers. They manufacture intimacy under artificial conditions, then send people back to their lives pretending nothing followed them home. Most of the time, that illusion holds. This time, it cracked. That evening, Jamie did something that looked dramatic from the outside and felt inevitable from the inside. He disappeared. Not theatrically, not defiantly. He turned off his phone, got into his car, and drove without destination until the city thinned into silence. Hours later, he found himself somewhere familiar, a small and overlooking the Irish coast, a place tied to an earlier version of himself, before global attention, before constant interpretation, before every gesture was evaluated for meaning. There, without advisors, without headlines, without an audience, the noise finally stopped. And in that quiet, the question he'd been avoiding for years finally surfaced, not about Dakota, not about romance, but about truth. What did her words actually mean? Not to the internet, not to the media, not to the story being constructed around them. To him. Because stripped of spectacle, her statement wasn't a claim. It was a recognition. She hadn't said she wanted him. She hadn't said she loved him. She had said something far more unsettling, that he had mattered to her in a way that shaped who she became. That he had seen her when she hadn't fully seen herself. That the connection they shared was not fictional, even if it was contained. And the reason that truth felt so dangerous wasn't because it threatened his marriage. It was because it threatened the narrative he had built about emotional containment, the idea that as long as lines weren't crossed, nothing needed to be examined. But silence has a way of stripping stories down to their bones. Alone with the sound of the ocean and the weight of years unspoken, Jamie began to understand that what Dakota had done wasn't expose a secret. She had exposed an avoidance, an agreement to never name something because naming it would require responsibility. Responsibility doesn't always mean action. Sometimes it simply means acknowledgement. And that, more than anything else, was what the world had stumbled into by accident. By the time Dakota Johnson released her statement, the story had already begun to exhaust itself. That's how these cycles usually end, not with understanding, but with fatigue. Audiences move on. Headlines lose urgency. Algorithms find something newer, louder, easier to digest. Most public ruptures are resolved not because they're healed, but because attention shifts elsewhere. Silence returns, and with it the comforting illusion that nothing fundamental has changed. Except this time, something resisted being buried. Dakota's statement didn't arrive like an apology or a denial. It didn't try to wrestle control back from the narrative with force. In fact, it did something far more subversive. It refused to participate in the drama at all. No defensiveness. No emotional spectacle. No clarifying details designed to satisfy curiosity. Just a reframing so simple it felt almost anticlimactic. My words were about gratitude, not romance. In any other context, that sentence would have ended the story immediately. But here, it did the opposite. Because what she was really saying, without spelling it out, was that the public had misunderstood the nature of what they were witnessing. This wasn't a confession of desire. It was an admission of impact. And impact is far harder to argue with. Gratitude implies history. It implies transformation. It implies that something meaningful occurred, even if it never took a visible form. Dakota didn't deny the emotional weight of the connection. She validated it, while simultaneously refusing to turn it into something transactional or scandalous. She didn't retreat from truth. She redefined it. That's why the tone of the conversation shifted almost instantly. Not because everyone suddenly agreed, but because her framing removed the audience's favorite tools. You can debate romance. You can argue betrayal. You can assign blame. But gratitude? Gratitude doesn't offer villains. It doesn't invite outrage. It doesn't give the internet anything to punish. It simply sits there, uncomfortably sincere, asking to be taken at face value. For the first time since the interview, people began replaying the clip not to decode implication, but to observe emotion. Her trembling voice no longer sounded reckless, it sounded vulnerable. Her pause no longer looked calculated, it looked human. And the moment that had been framed as a disruption started to look like something else entirely, an honest emotional reflex